Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chief Strategy Officer for the Center for Understanding Change, Mr. Brad Holtz.
Thank you for joining us. We're here with Giganot and Nicole Gooden, and this is the last session of the last day, and we're here to wrap it up. The topic today is capacity for global change, and we're going to start off with Trevor talking about the Change Readiness Index, and you'll find a copy of the Change Readiness Index on your table for review. Trevor, you want to just kick it off and explain to us what the index is? And
okay, thanks, Brad. And firstly, thanks to those of you that have actually made it here, because I think it's like a process of attrition over a 2-day period, isn't it? So I don't know whether it's like selection of the fittest or natural selection, or whether you're just the ones who've come early for the cocktails. But anyway, we're glad you made it, because otherwise we'd have felt a bit sad sitting here talking to ourselves. So thank you for making it. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you sort of fairly briefly about the Change Readiness Index. I lead KPMG's Development Center of Excellence, and a few years ago now, we decided that we wanted to actually take a look at why some countries are able to actually adapt quickly to change, whether it be negative or positive. So whether it's a shock or whether it's an opportunity, and whether why other countries don't find it that easy. So I have to say our graphics people came up with these, and the transitions are kind of a bit slow in my view, but anyway. So we came up with a definition of what we thought change readiness was. So we were looking at a country's capacity to anticipate, prepare for, manage and respond to change and cultivate opportunities. So why did we decide to do this? Well, we had a group of people were at Davos in 2010, and the earthquake in Haiti had just taken place. There'd also been a devastating earthquake in Chile, and I think people were sort of looking at each other and saying, well, actually, the aid, the support is going to work in Chile, and it's probably not going to work in Haiti. Well, why is that? What are the factors that would cause that to be the case? And if you can identify what those factors are, then you can actually take action to mitigate it, and therefore you can recover more quickly. And equally, if there are positive opportunities, you can position yourself to take advantage of them. So we looked to see what was available. I'm just looking. I'm not. Oh, there we go. That's the slide. We looked to see what was available out there, because obviously we didn't want to reinvent something that already existed. And what we found was that there really wasn't anything that actually comprehensively covered this. So we came up with a methodology which was a sort of view of how you look at change. We then went out to look and see if we could populate that from existing secondary data. And we could populate about 70% of it. There were some gaps. And then we decided that what we would do is actually fill those gaps ourselves. So we went out and we actually commissioned primary research, initially in 60 countries. And that led to the sort of beta test version, which was 60 countries, and a fairly limited number of factors that we were covering. We then took it out, socialized it, got reaction from people and feedback, because I think we're pretty clear on this, that this is kind of a 10-year journey for us. We don't believe that the first version or even the second version is going to be spot on, but we believe it's sort of an evolutionary process. And we went to a number of organizations. We went to the World Bank, the UN, the World Economic Forum, and a number of others. And we said, would you be prepared to act as an advisory panel to take a look at what we've done and give us your feedback on where you think we need to strengthen it, where you think perhaps there's duplication, where there could be change. So we did that, and we got some fantastic feedback. So we did the second version in 2013. We'd pushed up to 90 countries by then, much more robust data set, much more detail work. So rather than just high-level numbers, we were really able to drill down into the data. For this year, 2015, we've pushed it out now to 127 countries. And again, we've broadened the sample in each country as well. We've continued to refine it. Our statisticians all get excited about doing correlations and all things like that. And they're continuing to refine the variables so that we're avoiding duplication and all technical stuff like that that they do, which they tell me is good. You're probably going to say more about that, aren't you? So we wanted to come up with something then that we thought would be a useful tool, that would be something that would actually enable people to take a look at the data and use it as a way really to start discussion and start debate. We don't expect this to be an answer. We're not saying this gives you the solution. What we're saying is that it points you in the direction of areas to look at, that perhaps need further study, that perhaps need a country to actually look at it and see what action they need to take. So there's a tremendous amount of data that's been generated. All of the data sets are made available. If you go to the online tool, you can get into the data, you can download it into Excel, you can play about with it, you can do country comparisons by income group and all that kind of thing. And that's the interesting thing. And what we're looking at is obviously the feedback that we get now from organizations about the utility of the data, the timeliness of the data, the range of things that we're covering, and how we can continually improve this. So I'm just pressing the clicker and it's kind of, what's it doing down there? Not much. Oh, there we go. There we go. So just to take you through, I don't know where I'm supposed to be pointing this. I'm pointing it down here, and I'm maybe supposed to be pointing it over there.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. Okay. So in terms of the data, we have obviously delayed pressing here. There we go. So in terms of the data, we're now covering about whizzing along here. Right, it's now come back to that. Okay, we're covering about 97% of the world population now in 127 countries. So what that means is there's a number of small countries that we're not covering. Mainly, they're very small, or they're very difficult to get the data, because what we've tried to do is use data that we can get comparable data sets from the various different countries. And that's quite difficult. There are a number of things that we might have liked to look at that we just couldn't get data. So what we've tried to do is use robust data sets from reputable sources, people like the World Bank Doing Business Index, the WEF Economic Forum, the Garton Index, UN Human Development Report, and then supplement that with primary data of our own gathered in the countries. So what does that mean then in terms of what we're sort of finding? There we go. In terms of the sort of methodology, we took a view when we started looking at this. A lot of indices actually look at GDP or enterprise. Quite a number also look at fragility or government capability to respond. What we didn't find was anything that really looked at sort of people and civil society. And we believe, certainly looking at the SDGs and going forward, that to achieve them, you need to engage both private sector, private enterprise, governments, and people in civil society. I think as you heard from Ban Ki-moon and Thomas Gass earlier today, these are only going to work if citizens and governments in the countries around the world take the SDGs, internalize them, and actually use them as targets that they can commit to on a country-by-country basis. It's not going to be something that's going to be imposed top-down by the UN or anybody else. It has to be something that countries buy into. And that means citizens need to be heavily engaged. So we believe having an index that actually looks at enterprise, the private sector, government, and people in civil society enables you to actually cover all those aspects which we believe are very important to actually building sustainable change in the countries around the world. So I need training in pressing buttons, I tell you. I was saying I would never go into a political role, because if you gave me something like this and said, don't press this button, there would be another world war. pretty soon, because I'd be like, what does that one do? But in terms of results, just to give you a sort of taste, and there is a copy of the document on your desk, on your table. In terms of the top 10, and I'm sure someone will say, why isn't the US in the top 10? It's number 20, and I can talk about that in a minute. But in terms of the top 10, all of the top 10 countries are generally high income. They've got relatively small populations, under about 10 million. They're all stable countries. So there's a sort of pattern there. Now, the thing that's interesting about that is that high income alone is not a guarantee of ability to change. And I'll give you a couple of instances of that. I mean, if you go back to the 1960s and look at, say, South Korea as an example, South Korea was probably one of the poorest countries on the planet at the end of the Korean War. And now it's G20 nations, and it's a net donor. It's spending about $5 billion a year. So it's been able to totally turn it around. Singapore is another example. When it became independent again, it was again one of the poorest countries. It's been able to grow. So there's considerable opportunity to do that. But there's still tremendous issues of inequality as well in a number of these countries that need to be tackled. And even in countries like Singapore, there are, if you look at the data in the round, there are strengths, but there are also clear weaknesses in the data. Now, this, I think one of the things that's quite useful in the data is to actually look at people who are actually performing rather better than you would think they would do, just purely based on GDP. And the countries on the right-hand side, Mozambique and the other 4 African countries, plus Cambodia, are all performing significantly better than you would expect them to do, just purely on a GDP comparison. That's interesting, and I'll show you in a second when I go on to the next slide. This is the one where our statisticians get all really excited. I'm not entirely sure why. It just looks like a bunch of dots on a piece of paper to me, but anyway, they like it. One, it's because it's got a high correlation. The other thing that I think is interesting is that what it shows is it's not just about wealth. That if the answer is rich countries are always going to be better prepared, are always going to be able to respond better to disasters, are always going to be able to take advantage of opportunity, it's a fairly depressing message. Because if you're down at a GDP per head of, say, $5,000 per head, if the response is, well, wait till you get to 50 and everything will be fine, just go for pure economic growth and eventually it'll trickle down and things will be wonderful. It's not a great message. What's interesting is where you have countries that have a similar level of GDP, GNI per head, where they are actually performing very differently. So if you take, say, Costa Rica and Venezuela, both very similar levels of GDP, but huge differences in terms of their change readiness, huge differences in terms of the quality of government, the responsiveness of government, the openness of the economy, the fact that the economy is broadly based rather than narrowly based on a single commodity, oil or another natural resource, and a much more inclusive approach to using and engaging with civil society rather than a slightly repressive approach. So you can start to see very quickly that it's not just about wealth, it's about how you use it, it's about the policy decisions that you make, and it's about the levels of inequality in your society. And that, I think, is a much more interesting message. So when you can actually drill down into the data, you can start to see how you can get at those data points and then how you can actually engage in those in conversations of the sort of action that you could take as a result of that. So from our point of view, in terms of how we see this being used, and I was in London last week and Bangkok the week before. In London, we were talking to a number of private equity organizations, banks, etc. And one of the things that's happening in that sector that's quite interesting, about 2 weeks ago, I think something happened in the US that probably is one of the most significant, potentially one of the most significant factors in terms of taking forward the SDGs, and probably not something that you would think of. It was the US Department of Labor issued a new guidelines on the 1974 Pension Provision Act. in the US. What it's actually done is it's changed the guidance to pension managers. It now says pension managers, rather than just looking at financial return, they now have to look at the environmental, the economic, the social, and the government impact. And that's quite interesting, because I was talking to you last week, are saying that they think that presents a tremendous opportunity now to access that sort of capital for social purposes. So I think that's an interesting one, because at the moment there's about $28 trillion tied up in pension funds. So when you're looking at the funding gap on the SDGs of being something in the region of $2 trillion, getting access to those sorts of funds and mobilizing them is a useful thing. As part of that, you need to get those pension fund managers comfortable about investing in some of those countries. Not so much an issue for private equity, because private equity are actually focusing on the company and the fundamentals of the company, and if the fundamentals are right, they'll look at it pretty much regardless of the country. But for the pension managers, they need to be able to satisfy themselves that putting the money into those investments is valid. So it's a useful tool on the investment side. It's also useful for development agencies and indeed for civil society organizations. I was in a discussion with the heads of many of the largest civil society organizations 3 weeks ago about how they can actually use the tool to actually inform some of their programming decisions. So it stimulates debate, it gets people engaged around the data, it enables you to focus on the relative strengths and weaknesses of a particular country, whether it be within its income group or whether it be within its region. And particularly at a regional level, it's something that actually is getting quite a lot of traction, where people are doing comparisons with their neighbors. I was in Côte d'Ivoire recently, and they were very interested in comparing how they performed relative to Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and other countries in the region. Pressing my pressing thing. Okay, so the thing I would do is go back one. The thing I would point out more than anything is the online tool. I mean, the brochure's quite nice, it's quite glossy, it's got lots of pictures in it and a few numbers, but the thing that's really useful is the ability to actually go online, access the data and use the data to do comparisons. So I would encourage you to take a look at the website, take a look at the tool, look at the data, which is broken down not just in terms of the overall scores which you see in the report, but also broken down below that then into the various pillars and sub-pillars. And you can then go into that data, you can look at how different countries are comparing with each other, you can go and see how our data sets compare to other data sets, and you could also compare it with sort of various core pieces of information such as tax take as a percentage of GDP, investment and other factors. So you can actually look at the characteristics of a country and how those characteristics are actually affecting its ability. So I think that's probably all I would say for now, Brad, yeah, by way of an introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor. We're going to get back to this online reference, but first we'll hear from Carolyn. And Carolyn, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, would you mind?
With the clicker.
Oh, sorry.
Of course.
Sorry.
Well,
And I'll talk about the Doing Business Index.
Thank you very much for having me here tonight. I work for the World Bank Group. I'm a senior economist in our Global Indicators department, and I'm here to present to you our flagship report, which is called Doing Business. It's in its 13th year now, and is one of the data sources that the Change Readiness Index would be using.
Absolutely.
Doing Business is probably more known with policymakers around the world than in the US, so I always love to present it in the US. Basically, what we do is we measure business regulation, and the way we do that is we go to lawyers around the world. We have about 14,000 pro bono contributors who fill out surveys for us and tell us, based on a case study, what it takes to do certain business regulatory processes in their country, and I'm going to get to which ones those are. The focus of the report is on the formal sector. That has to do with its history. It was conceived to actually try to address the issue of why so many firms stay in the informal sector. And because research had shown that it's often regulation that keeps firms from formalizing. It's also focused only on the most populous business city in every country, and we cover 189 countries. So we measure 11 areas of business regulation, which basically affect firms throughout the life cycle. Our most famous indicator is starting a business. And then basically we look at things like labor market regulations, contract enforcement, how long does it take to enforce a debt contract through the court system, electricity access, property registration, paying taxes, trading across borders, and then and credit, access to credit, and we end with resolving insolvency. So it's really the business cycle of a firm. One of the things that we've introduced this year is that we started not just measuring the efficiency side of regulation, because you have to imagine, for example, in starting a business, we ask a question, we present a lawyer with a case study about a small warehouse, and no, it's actually not, it's not the warehouse. In this case, it's another small business that wants to open up, and then the lawyer explains to us what are the procedures, the time and cost that it takes in a given country to get the firm registered. And you will find all this information on our website, including with the fee schedules, and so it's very transparent and therefore also very contestable, which I think is part of the success of the project. But for a long time, we were told that we were focusing too much on efficiency, so we now introduced also data on regulatory quality. And what we found, and we had a hunch before that that would be the case, but it's nice to see it confirmed, is the two are very much correlated. So countries that regulate efficiently and make it easy for businesses to comply with regulations also tend to have higher quality regulation. Another important finding is that, of course, where things are inefficient, meaning you have a lot of procedures to get things done, you also find very high levels of corruption, because obviously every procedure means an official you have to meet and who can potentially extract a bribe from you. And so then we rank countries, like most other indicator projects. You see, like for the Change Readiness Index, Singapore is our #1. Singapore has been the #1 for, I think, 9 years now, so it's consistently on top. And I think partly because it's also #1 on the Change Readiness Index. It's one of these countries that always asks us what can they do better, and so that's how they stay on top. That makes it unique is we also record all the reforms that countries make as they move up in the ranking. And so every year we come out with a list of the top 10 reformers. Those are the countries that made the biggest jump in the ranking. So they tend to come from the bottom or from lower levels often. So this year it was Costa Rica. And then we basically, we now have, I think we've recorded 2,600 business regulatory reforms around the world since 2004. And all these reforms you can find on our website as well. And what that allows us to do is now that we have 13 years of data, to also see global trends. So one of the trends that we've been observing over the years is that the region that consistently reforms the most is Europe and Central Asia. Initially, this was the EU accession process that drove this, but then, you know, other countries around the new EU members started to also reform to stay, you know, to keep a competitive edge with the Eastern European countries. So that region, it has been, I mean, since I've been working for the report, and that's 10 years, basically the active region. But we also see that some regions have increased their reform momentum. So Africa is one of these regions. In 2004 and 2005, only 31% of the economies in sub-Saharan Africa were reforming, and we're now looking at 74% of them. And what the data also allows us to do is to see where are reforms happening. Startup has been one of the the topics that has received the most attention. Access to credit is another one. So that what we cover there are things like, does a country have a credit bureau? What kind of information does the credit bureau collect? What is the collateral regime in the country? So these are input factors that make it easier for firms to get credit. And one of the areas that I always feel really sad about, because I think it's one of the most relevant areas of a business climate, is enforcing contracts, which receives very little attention by governments and where a lot of reforms are needed, but it's also a very, very difficult area to reform. Yeah, okay, so that's just an example of how things have changed on convergence, because basically what we can see now with all these reforms happening, there is a convergence towards best practices. So it was possible to start a business in less than 20 days in only 41 economies in in 2005, and by now it's 132 economies where it's possible to start a business for less than 20 days. So as that happens, of course, we also look into, can we add things to our indicators? That sometimes creates problems because governments reproach us that we're moving the yardstick. Our argument is, well, I mean, if you're doing well in something, let's move the yardstick. But you can imagine sometimes that creates problems. So just to summarize, I think the main points about doing business is when this project started, it was the first data set to put red tape and regulation on the agenda for policymakers, because we rank, it really receives a lot of attention from policymakers. Lots of countries have put it in their biggest reform agendas. And because we're very transparent in the data and it's very actionable data, it's also, of course, easy to use it to then identify best practices, learn from other countries that have made a lot of progress, and use those best practices to reform within countries. And I think the other important thing is by ranking, we have created an environment of friendly competition. I mean, some governments would say it's not so friendly, but we believe that we're basically providing a global good by serving as a conduit for information that governments should pay attention to. And if you think of a typical Minister of Finance, usually the span of their attention usually looks at the next parliamentary elections, or not parliamentary elections, but it's usually relatively short-term oriented. And focusing on red tape and bureaucracy is really not something that is particularly sexy or that policymakers would want to focus on. And so I think what the project has achieved is to make it necessary for them to pay attention to this very important area of the business environment. So thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. And Nicole, can you talk a little bit about about yourself, about what you've been doing, and about the Global Youth Wellbeing Index?
Sure, I will get to that, but don't worry, I'm not going to talk you through an index, but I just wanted to say, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and despite I know that we stand between you and the cocktail reception, I really appreciate you sort of bearing with us, and I actually am really excited to be part of this panel towards the end of the past couple of days of conversation, because I really think a lot of these conversation points follow with a lot of what I heard in some of the sessions that I was at about the connectivity between food, health, and prosperity, and across sectors, and really across the different pillars of the Change Readiness Index. So I am a development economist by training, and I spent the sort of early part of my development career working on governance, rule of law, and institutional reform issues. So again, really seeing my sort of personal career trajectory come together in this index, which is super helpful and gives me a sense of purpose, I guess, that I'm not, the chaos comes together. And most recently, for the last 5 years, I've been spending most of my time working on issues of global youth. And for me, when I think about change readiness, I really think about it in terms of youth and young people. And I think it's, again, a nice way to kind of start to bring some of these issues together, and they've started to come up in a number of the conversations. So why, when I think about how the capacity of countries to change, to develop, to reform and grow, do I think about young people? What's brought me to this place? And many of it is drawn upon and speaks to many of the indicators that are in the Change Readiness Index, and in particular demographics. And this came up earlier in the day, but some people are often stunned by the statistic if they haven't heard it before, but right now, roughly half the world's population is under the age of 30. And currently, about a quarter of the world's population are what we might categorize roughly as youth, between, say, 15 and 30. And another quarter, another 25% of the world's population will be growing into youth over the next 15 years, so over the life cycle of the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's pretty significant in and of itself. Even more interesting and important, I think, is that roughly 85% of this world's youth population lives in countries that are fragile. So, Fareed mentioned in his keynote yesterday that 65% of the population in the Middle East is under the age of 30. So 85% of the world's youth lives in fragile, emerging, and developing economies and states. And so that's really important context, again, when we're thinking about this capacity for change and where is change going to be happening is really in these countries. So I think it's at the heart of it. And what we see is that this population really is both a risk from a security perspective, but a huge opportunity for growth, for change, and for opportunity. And really, much of it is going to happen depending on what this generation, if you will, this cohort does, both economically, politically, and socially. Trevor mentioned, the change that we've seen in South Korea. And what's interesting, again, from an economic perspective, is that if you go back and look at part of what made that South Korea change and the East Asian miracle, if you will, in some of those tigers in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, is really about that demographic change. They had large, young populations, but it wasn't a guarantee. It required investment in health, in education, so bringing in the health, bringing in the education to get to that prosperity. Some economists say that as much as a third of that rapid miracle growth in East Asia can be attributed to this demographic dividend, the payoff from investing in this young population. So there really is a huge opportunity, but the questions are outstanding if the countries are making the investments in education, in health, managing inequality so that countries can grow productively, so that youth, can feel part of the equation, to really see that. One of the projects that I worked on for the Center for Strategic International Studies, our flagship project, was the Global Youth Wellbeing Index. And I think we just have a slide of the landing page, but you can go to youthindex.org and look at the data. And what's interesting was, again, on this point about the interconnectivity between governance, between individual capability, and to some degree enterprise capability, as well as the governing environment, we really saw that interconnectivity as well in the Global Youth Wellbeing Index that we used to sort of get a sense of how young people were doing around the world. And at the time, we were able to include 30 countries in the inaugural index, which came out last year. But one of the things, again, that was interesting was the state of global youth is not so great. And so we really use this to sort of push this forward. And just to give a couple quick points, and then we'll have a discussion. But in the index, we found that roughly 85% of the world's youth were living in countries that fell below the kind of mean score across the index, which was 40 indicators in 6 areas. So that doesn't necessarily bode so well. And again, when you look around what's happening in the world, it somewhat speaks to this yearning not only for a sense of sort of purpose and value, but also an economic aspiration. And that aspiration gap is something that we really see as a challenge. But again, to sort of get back to some of the economic points, and what we're seeing is that if you look around the world right now, we also have, there's a sort of a global youth employment crisis that's affecting not only advanced economies, but other, certainly developing economies as well. Young people today are roughly, up to 4 times more likely to be unemployed than adults. About a third of the world's youth is not in employment or education or training. Many that are employed, we talked about informality came up in the context of cities and moving to the cities. Many that are employed are in very vulnerable work, not really going to be producing and contributing to the economic growth. They won't be able to be this engine of economic growth that they need to be. So there's really a lot of challenges. And again, when we look to what's needed going forward, how are countries going to be able to change? Again, on the employment piece, the populations of countries that are both urbanizing the fastest, as came up in some of the conversations in Africa and in Asia, are also the countries that are going to continue to have rapid population growth, large youth populations, and need to generate as much as 1 million jobs a month in India alone. 1 million jobs a month in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a sort of a global need for roughly 5 million jobs a month to be generated worldwide a month for the next decade, just to keep employment rate constant. So again, just when you think about this capacity for global change, I think about education levels. I think about all of these things that are happening within the individual and how they relate to government, to enterprise capability, to change. So I'm going to stop there so that we can have time for some discussion. I know we've got lots of different perspectives.
So thank you, Nicole. I want to point out these are three very deep wells resources that are free and available to explore, and the whole point behind putting this out there is to foster and enable conversation. I think the Global Youth Wellbeing Index is particularly interesting in light of Fareed's comments yesterday morning. If we have 25% of the population coming up in locations where they're unlikely to have means of income, that is a huge potential for future disruption on a global scale. And if we need to be figuring out how are we going to deal with that? What are the mechanisms that we're going to be dealing with going forward? Carolyn, you have an index, the Doing Business Index, which has really pointed out that metrics drive actions. And you've got longitudinal data that shows not only how the individual at the country level have shifted over time, but what I thought was unique about your index is that it's actually tracking the actions that led to the movements in the index. And I think that it becomes then a touch point to drive further actions, particularly from the neighbors that they compete with. Can you give us any specific examples that you know of that, where you've seen that and what can be done to drive that further?
Examples of other countries reacting, or?
How the countries are seeing movements that they're, specific actions. It's not just movement in the index, but it said, we took this regulation and got rid of it and changed this.
Well, I mean, the example that I still like the best is Georgia in Central Asia and Caucasus. So Georgia is a country that from the inception of doing business basically took the index and said, this is going to be our roadmap for regulatory reform. And so we've seen them rising just up through the ranking, into the top 10. But what was happening at the same time was that they also improved on a lot of other indices. So this is one of these beautiful examples where you can see them moving on the Human Development Index, on the Anti-Corruption Index. So they've because if you actually want to change institutions, you have to change the entire business model of a country or the way things are done, and that's what Georgia did. And then I remember a few years ago, we had the advisor to the president visiting us, and I asked him, so it's a very small country, where do you actually see the benefits of all these reforms? And he shared this little piece of information with me, which I think illustrated everything for me. He said, well, last year we looked at our balance of payment, and for the first time, we were exporting cars, and we do not produce cars. And so they got curious themselves. They're like, why are we exporting cars? And then they realized that Toyota had set up the headquarters in Georgia to use it as a distributional center for the entire region. Because this tiny little country had distinguished itself so much from its neighbors in terms of business friendliness, in terms of contract enforcement, that this big Japanese automaker was saying, this is a safe place to be. And from there, we can take Toyota into the region. And so it's, for me, the most powerful example of how even a small country can use, this kind of information to improve its business climate and see where it takes it. Rwanda is the equivalent in Africa. It's in a horrible region. There is lots of instability, lots of violence still around, and they have distinguished themselves so much now from the rest of the world that they're also, they're perceived as the little Switzerland of Africa. So what I like about it is a little bit the same point as Trevor was making. It's not a function of GDP per capita. Yes, GDP per capita helps because it means resources. But when it comes to institutions, small countries can, or poorer countries can achieve a lot, and the benefits will show up.
Can I just pick up on that in relation to the comment you made about jobs? I mean, yes, when we think about sort of young people and the future and the security situation, jobs, economic opportunity are hugely important. But one of the things that we also, I think, maybe don't pay as much attention to is the broader sort of sense of participation in governance, in society, in sort of social change, and in, in politics, if you will. And one of the interesting things that we saw in the Youth Wellbeing Index is, even within a relatively smaller inaugural set of countries of 30, is that what was interesting is that countries that were sort of at the top of the general ranks, including the US and Germany, many of them fell in the citizen participation ranking. So even though you're sort of a country of, you think democracy and opportunity for expression, the young people, arguably had, relatively better economic opportunities, open democracies, and still felt that they didn't really have a stake in the game, and yet countries, India, South Africa, Tanzania, really rose to the top of the ranks in citizen participation. I just bring that up as an example of, again, even where financial resources may not be available, there are other ways to at least sort of create space for young people to be engaged. And it's not to say, again, jobs are critically important for sure, but what we see in Arab Spring wasn't only about jobs. If you look at around the world at a lot of these sort of youth-led demonstrations, I think obviously this is maybe different from the sort of extremism conversation. But if you look around at sort of youth-led social change and demonstration, it's not only negative, and I want to sort of put that out there as well, but it's also not necessarily based on jobs. It may be based on education financing. The recent protests in South Africa were about sort of education fees. So I just put that out there because I think we need to, again, think holistically as the Sustainable Development Goals sort of encourage us to do, and take a broader look at what really sort of change development and sort of human capacity means.
So one of the reasons that you'll see well-developed countries drop on these indices is because, particularly when it comes to participation, is the pressure is not there. The pressure for change, the driving factors that are getting people up out of their seats to get up on the streets. And as things improve, you get to the point where you have the luxury of apathy, if you will. Trevor, can you talk a little bit about the value and the role of the benchmarking segment? We talked about the like versus like. There's a page in the index, I think it's page 12 if you've got it with you, where we're actually seeing how your like countries are compared. Yeah, it's at page 11.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that struck us as being quite interesting is if you look in any income group, so whether it's upper middle, lower, or low income, the top country in each income group was actually from Asia, which I think was quite interesting, and the bottom country in each income group tended to vary, but particularly if you looked at Africa, you'd find that many of the African countries were obviously clustered towards the bottom of the index. Now, that's particularly important, I think, because you heard yesterday and today people talking about the bottom billion and the need to focus on the bottom billion. I would actually challenge that, and I would say that the issue is much, much bigger than that, because if you look at the MDGs, when the MDGs were achieved essentially, as you heard, mainly as a result of tremendous progress in China and India, which brought down the poverty figures. Most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa actually failed on most of the MDGs. That's where there is the most dramatic growth in population, as Nicole was saying. If you look at the population of sub-Saharan Africa today, it's just over 1 billion people. Within the next 25 years, that's going to hit 2.5 billion. Now, if you just sort of take that in context, so out of that number, you've got today about 250 million people in Africa have access to electricity. So that's a power industry about the same size as the US. So it's a pretty significant power industry. So within the next 25 years, we're talking about growing a power industry in Africa, which is 10 times the size of the US's power industry. Now just think about that for a minute in terms of the infrastructure, the ability to actually transmit, to distribute that power, to actually get that out there, and to resource that. You know, how are you going to do that? Is it going to be coal? Is it going to be gas? Is it going to be sustainable resources? How are you going to fund it? You look at a typical power station, it takes 8 to 10 years from concept to actually live operation. So if you're looking at those populations growing dramatically in Africa, you've got a major, major challenge to deal with. If you do that, then you've got what's called this youth dividend. You've got the ability to get these people into employment. You can see that coming through in significant economic growth. The danger, I think, and the danger we see in the Change Readiness Index is that 8 of the bottom 10 countries are in Africa. And in most of those countries, you're seeing very, very little progress and very, very little indication that they are actually moving in a way where they can take advantage of the opportunities. So I think there's a real issue in terms of, everybody talks about leave no one behind, but there's an issue about how do you actually target particularly the fragile and post-conflict states, and how do you focus mainly, I think, development expenditure, because there's a question as to whether the private sector are going to be investing in the fragile and post-conflict states. They're going to be focusing, I think, more in the middle-income countries. Yeah.
So I want to talk specifically to that point, the relationship between low score, particularly in Africa, on the index, and the political systems, governments, courts, and the rule of law.
Yeah. I mean, generally speaking, I would say, and obviously you need to drill into the data on a country-by-country basis to really look at it. But generally speaking, I would say the governance institutions, the rule of law, are much, much weaker in those countries. You also see that they're relatively weak in terms of the inclusiveness of civil society, so they're not really mobilizing all of their population. Now, that can be for a number of reasons. As you heard from Fareed, there's repressive regimes which are looking to keep the population down. There are others that are trying, but we're also seeing, particularly in a number of countries in Africa and actually worryingly as well now in some countries in Asia, a crackdown on civil society, what's called shrinking civil society space. We're seeing more and more of that as countries are actually tightening up restrictions on the ability to actually use data in terms of lobbying. India, for example, has just recently tightened up. Ford Foundation has found itself in difficulty in India. That's been all over the press because they were seen as potentially lobbying against India's national interest. And that means economic interest. So there's continually this challenge between government creating the regime, which you see with the Doing Business Index, creating the environment for growth, freeing the shackles so that private sector can invest, but not in a completely unrestricted way, but in a way that gives you a balanced growth that actually enables you to improve equality in the economy. We've certainly seen in the data that many of the weaker countries, in particular income groups, are countries which have high levels of natural resource dependency. So they're dependent on a single product. It very often goes alongside with weak governance, weak courts, high levels of corruption, etc. And we're not then seeing the economic benefit of that growth going through. I mean, a classic example of that would be Nigeria, for example. I mean, Nigeria has gone over the life of the MDGs from being about the third most prosperous country in Africa to the most prosperous. When the MDGs kicked off, Nigeria had 58 million people living in poverty. Today, it's now the wealthiest country in Africa. It's one of the major exporters of oil. Under the success of the MDG, it now has 104 million people living in poverty. So even with that massive GDP growth, the distribution has not been there. And you can just see the impact of that if you look at northern Nigeria, where you see the increasing radicalization taking place, with communities that see themselves as being disenfranchised and see themselves as not benefiting from that natural resource wealth. So yes, I think there's a very clear correlation between them coming through.
So
in the
we
data.
have about 10 minutes left before we are able to go to the alcohol. I'd like to look at the other side of the scale and talk a little bit about the relationship between the three indices and resilience. And we've been talking about resilience, particularly with food, health, and prosperity. And I'd like each of you to have a few remarks specifically about the relationship between what you've been investigating and how that carries forward in thinking about the ability to respond to change.
Sure, I'm happy to start. It's a really interesting question. And, for me, I've been sort of sitting in on a lot of resilience conversations. It's a hot topic, as you noted. And I'm always, again, intrigued as somebody that spends most of my work looking at individual well-being, individual or human security almost, whether it's young people, looking at how women are faring in society with a sort of gender lens, women versus men in a given society. So the resilience conversation is often, again, looking at the country or community even's ability and sort of to respond to shocks. And I often sort of come back and say, well, let's bring it back to the individual, and it comes back to these ideas of sort of individual well-being, and if you sort of bring that in aggregate, what does it mean for resilience? And so that's one piece of it. I think one of the other important aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals, and it relates to these ideas of the indexes, is how we will be measuring and implementing and measuring progress. And it came up in the conversation. So when we're talking about indexes and data and thinking about this, I think about sort of how are we going to sort of continue to measure resilience, and is it a factor that will go into, does it affect performance on the SDGs, or is it affected by performance? It's a little bit of both in my mind. And just lastly, again, I think a lot of this is integrated to what you're just talking about. So land rights, for example, is another one of these sort of governance pieces that has a huge impact on entrepreneurship ability, on sort of rights, on ability to sort of build assets and move forward. It's interesting we're having this conversation. It's Global Entrepreneurship Week, which many of you may be aware of. And so I just kind of keep that again in the back of my mind as we're thinking about individual opportunity versus community, family. And so I think it's just that level of analysis, and I think we need to be working at all the levels to really have a broader view of resilience.
Carolyn?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's not a question that usually I would think about in the context of doing business. But now that I've been asked to think about it, doing business is about small and medium-sized enterprises. They provide about 60% of jobs in the world, and it's about them because there is another 30% of firms that are just in the informal sector, and I think that tells you a lot about how enfranchised or disenfranchised, people feel in society. So to the extent that you can bring them into the formal economy, it's an important signal to governments that there is trust in the government, that people think it has value to be taxed and because they're receiving something in return. So that's why we believe focusing on private sector development is actually really important, and on the formalization of firms. And I think also one of the other issues is, and this is a little bit the question you asked before about the rule of law. I think one should really not underestimate how important justice systems are. And I'm not just talking about the right justice, but just that justice is even granted. We always say justice delayed is justice denied, because what we look at is the time it takes to get a very simple case for the court system. And what I find very interesting is that there is an enormous wealth of literature out there showing that countries that have strong contract enforcement systems have so many other benefits that you wouldn't necessarily think of to begin with. From, credit is more accessible because collateral can actually be enforced. Credit is cheaper because collateral can be enforced. We even find that trade patterns are different. So countries that have good contract enforcement systems trade more sophisticated goods, because these goods can be, if they're very contractual by nature, there can be a dispute about it. So these things are very important, and when it comes to resilience, I know that the Sustainable Development Goals have one on the rule of law and justice. That, for me, is one of the most important ones, but that's my very personal view, to be honest.
Trevor?
I guess I'd probably take a slightly different tack, I think. Resilience, fragility, all of that in a sense is negative. It's kind of saying, if bad stuff happens, how quickly can you react to it, and how quickly can you recover from it? And I think that's one part of it. I think what we've tried to look at is tried to say, well, in a sense, that's kind of a depressing thing. It's like, listen, all this bad stuff's coming your way and you've got to deal with it. I think what I'm also interested in is not just how do you deal with the bad stuff, but how do you take advantage of the opportunities out there? Because we heard this morning with sort of the Internet of Things, with the massive rise of technology, with nanotechnology, with all of these different things, there are tremendous opportunities out there. Yes, there's environmental problems. Yes, there's all the shocks, but there's also opportunities. Now, I think we need to balance it. We can't just look at the negative and say, let's spend all our time focusing on dealing with the bad stuff. I think the countries that are going to be successful are the ones that can also grasp the opportunities that are out there. And I think we need to actually balance that when we're actually looking at whether it be resilience or whether it be change. And I think one of the things that we've tried to do with the Change Readiness Index is look at inputs, not outputs. So we're trying to look at levers that people can actually look at and can kind of try and pull to get a change. And I think that's something I think slightly different in the way of looking at it, yeah.
So thank you. And I want to bring up a couple of concepts before we close. First of all, the concept of viscosity of doing business. Viscosity of doing business. How thick or thin is that flow that we have to fight in order to do something? When we have the Change Readiness Index, the concept of this of viscosity as what we're trying to our ability to change is impacted by the velocity of the river that we're walking through. The concept of this is not a set of tools that is designed just for governments. This is a set of tools that is designed for conversations, and for conversations at all different levels. And each of us, regardless of the role that we play, can start and finish many conversations out of this, and we should look at this as a strategic resource. And finally, I want to thank Scott and the Global Action Platform and Cheryl for inviting us here, and my distinguished panel. And I welcome you to join us out the doors for the cocktail reception. Thank you.